Welcome to our Going Green podcast, and today we're going to have a look at the topic of more food from less space. And we're going to try and ask simple questions like, why can't I grow wheat in my greenhouse, and a few other little things like that. But you already came back to me on that one when I said, I can't grow wheat in my greenhouse. And you said, oh, yes, you can. I said, oh, no, I can't. You said, oh, yes, you can. So I haven't got a greenhouse.
Yeah, well, that was the issue I found. The answer is, so I Googled the simple question of, why aren't you growing wheat in your greenhouse? To the sunny answer of, here's 5 ways to improve your wheat in your greenhouse. And went, okay, so people are growing wheat in people's greenhouses.
Yeah, you can do it.
And then I saw the article, so why aren't people growing wheat in their greenhouses? And the answer is very simple. People want to grow flowers as opposed to boring wheat. And I'm like, so there you go. So the first critical thing is you can buy wheat. You can grow wheat in your greenhouses, but people aren't, because wheat's boring.
It doesn't look very pretty.
It comes golden in the autumn, or just when you're about to harvest. But that's about the excitement you get from growing wheat.
Well, I suppose you could grow other things, like for you could grow some hops.
Yeah.
And you could grow your own specific types of hops or barley or various other things if you want to make your homemade beer and do things like that. But what we're basically talking about is, rather than can we actually grow wheat in our greenhouse, really we're trying to see is, can we get more food from less space? We live in the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom's a certain size. And try hard as we may, you can't make it any bigger.
No.
And you've only got so much land, and some of that land, of course, is going to be used for housing, but the rest of it, it's used for either food production, or it can't be used for food production, so it's like mountains or something.
Yeah, and even worse, quite a lot of the island or we live on is actually being eroded, so we're getting less and less space. But that's a slightly different story in regards to what we're talking about. But no, did you know that the estimated global population is set to grow to 9 billion within the next decade?
And that means all those extra people need to be fed. And so we've got to try and get this idea of more food from less space. Well, we can do that. And since the sort of, about the 1960s, we've seen a sort of a 30% increase on the amount of food we're getting from the same sort of things, the same area. We've got, I looked up some figures for the sort of cereal yields from the 19th century.
Ooh.
And they were getting about 2 sort of tons per hectare. And by the 1950s, it was sort of 4. And now we're getting sort of 6 or more. And that is by using things like fertilizers, but also better crops. This word, when I'm going to use it, that upsets so many people, genetically engineered or genetically modified. And before people start going berserk on this, we have been, like farmers, have been genetically modifying plants and our sort of cattle, pigs, sheep for the last 10,000 years.
Yeah.
And that's by just selectively breeding. We say, well, look, let's take one of this. I'm going to take my best milker, and I'm going to take my best bull that makes the most meat, and let's mate them together. And what I'm going to do is, hopefully that's going to give me a better milker with more meat on it. Mm-hmm. And that process has been going on for the last 10,000 years, and it's been doing reasonably well. It's been a bit hit and miss, because you might not get the best out of crossing the best two, but that sort of genetic modification by selective breeding has been going on quite happily, and no one's really got any major problems and issues with that.
No. It's when a lovely little scientist comes in and plays around with it. That's what people don't like. But if you're doing it, if you let nature play around with it, and you're just happily selectively choosing what nature should be able to play with, then that's fine, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's see. Let's just take some crops. What sort of things could we do to try and improve them? Well, a lot of insects get into crops and they sort of, wipe out a lot of crops. I watched a certain program with a certain very experienced farmer of no years, Clarkson.
Yeah.
And he was sort of devastated to find that one of his fields was supposed to be full of a crop, and it had just been ravaged by insects.
Exactly.
And if he'd bought, instead of, well, he wouldn't have done this because it was done by the farmer before him, but a different crop, a different, if you like, strain of a crop that was insect resistant, then his yield could have been quite substantial.
He could actually have cultivated, or more precisely, harvested all that crop, and would have actually been able to sell it and then make some onto the marketplace, which is fair enough. That's fine. Now, the major thing, of course, is with these pesticides, or more precisely, making crops pest resistant, is that you've got to know why the pest is eating or how they're eating, and what other plants are actually doing to prevent them. That, you say, well, how do I prevent a plant from eating me? Well, the answer is, well, you've got to have something that's sticky, or even something that they don't like to land on, or you make your flesh, the plant leaf material, don't taste nice.
But what you can actually do, you can be rather crafty. You actually sow, let's suppose I choose wheat, for example. So I've got my field full of wheat. If I actually plant less wheat, but I put some strips down there with lots of other plants, and these other plants attract other insects that might eat the ones that are going to eat my wheat, then although I've actually planted less wheat, my yield will actually be increased because I'm not going to suffer my insect damage. And that's not with buying sort of insect resistant or genetically modified crops. That's just using what they used to do in the old days, a bit of common sense, trying to sort of get sort of insects to work with you rather than to sort of work against you.
Yes.
And they also used to have things like crop rotation.
Well, they still technically do have crop rotation at the minute,
but not as much as they used to. And often nowadays you can plant the same crop in the same field year upon year upon year if you shove in lots of fertilizers. Whereas if you go to the crop rotation system that we've had in this country for the last about 2,000 years, it works really well.
Yeah, and that's so you can replace nutrients in the soil and doing off years and all those sorts of methods. And lots of the world are slowly transforming to go to that method, as opposed to the direct sort of year upon year method, because they're finding that they are using using more resources to grow less. Now, that doesn't make economic sense. So you've got to find something that uses less but grows more, because then you obviously get more money, and that's how economic sense of it. And
but it's not just that though. That insect I chose, but how about drought resistance? Now we're talking about this sort of climate change, and we're going to get more and more droughts. We're going to get sort of, in theory, wetter winters and drier summers. I don't know if that's necessarily going to be what every country is going to have, and you want to try and find crops that are going to be more drought resistant. And there are some genetically modified crops that are more sort of drought resistant than others. They can grow in much drier areas. They can conserve water, and that could be a benefit. We've also got herbicide resistance. So you can throw in some sort of herbicides to stop other plants growing and competing with your wheat or something to try and do that. But you can get around that better just by tilling the soil.
Yes.
That was a good answer. That was a nice, quick, concise answer. I expected you to leap in with a bit more there.
Well,
yeah, so we can do herbicide resistance, but we can do the same, but by just more intelligent sort of farming here. The big problem is that if you have tilling the soil, you actually get more carbon emissions.
Well, that's the problem with yeah. I remember in this lovely little show, telling us that sort of, tilling the soil is great, it works, it's glory, except of course, you're churning up the soil and that's releasing instead of all the carbon that's just been put into it, released.
Well, not all, but a lot of it.
Yeah. We'll glance over that. Yeah, exactly. And, people go, well, what's the point of tilling? Because of course, if you till your soil, you get effectively a blank slate.
Yes, because all those little seeds that have come from all over the place by the wind and landed on that soil, ready to grow, you've now buried them deep, sort of, a few inches underground, too much for them to survive. And by the time they can sort of pop their little shoot up, they're dead because they haven't got enough energy to do that. So, yeah, tilling can be really useful to increase the productivity, but you're reducing the carbon content of the soil by throwing it out as carbon dioxide.
So one of the things I know the UK government is doing, as in DEFRA, which is this Department for Agriculture and Food and
Fisheries and all that.
Who knows what they stand for?
Yeah.
Anyway, they do lots of farming subsidies. Now, if they give a farming subsidy, if a farmer, instead of planting 100% coverage of wheat or his crop, he only does, say, 70% coverage, and he actually puts in 30% wild field, if that makes sense.
Yeah, wild plants to grow, yeah.
And this is to help sort of, because all the benefits that brings, and that brings to the fields and all things to help.
Yeah, so that gives this insect resistance. It can actually help the drought because some of these plants can sort of manage the water better. You can get some of this sort of problems with herbs, with herbicides, but these plants can actually help by sort of cutting down on the other plants, and it can get rid of some of the diseases that can happen, and that's quite good. So it's the right thing, going the right way, sort of planting less and putting in more of the wild stuff, which encourages all sorts of other things to sort of grow better. And you don't have to go down the sort of genetically modified route. But I think for some countries, they may not have much choice.
No.
There's an example of this. There was a big sort of problem in Hawaii growing papaya a few years ago, and basically the papaya was completely destroyed by a virus called ring spot.
Right.
And you couldn't grow papaya, but someone got a disease resistant version of the papaya, and now they can grow it quite happily because it's resistant to that particular virus.
Right.
So that can work, but it depends your views on eating genetically modified food.
Yeah, I know. It's one of those things where...
Well, I've seen quite a few people who've eaten genetically modified food and they've got these extra arms and legs and heads, and no, I haven't actually.
Yeah,
it's generally where people aren't terribly well educated and understand that just by changing something genetically, it isn't going to do something, because we've been changing them genetically by sort of selective breeding anyway, and sometimes we're just sort of helping things along.
Yeah. Oh, I know. It's just a natural process. We're just speeding on. One of the things we talk about also is sort of, is how much land we're giving up towards to grow the crop, these crops, but more importantly, how much crops are grown not for us, but for, let's say, the animals to feed on, as opposed to for us. Because got to remember that what was it, something like 95% of all crops we can't actually eat, and it's like, what? And we need the animals in agriculture, to actually
Eat them, yeah.
eat them.
An example is, of course, something easy like grass.
Yes, exactly. And we can't eat the grass. We don't actually. If you eat some grass, it just comes straight out of you. You can't process it. Whereas a cow is actually able to. So eating once the cow's grown, obviously, eating the cow, suddenly we've actually eaten something that and gotten energy from a source which we could never have gotten before we got the domesticated the cows. And so the idea that although we are growing lots of crops, we're actually converting unusable crop growing land. This is the unarable.
Yeah. We know what you mean. Yeah. So
just
stuff you couldn't grow crops on.
Yeah, crops you could.
The side of a hill, for instance.
Exactly. You can put the grass, there's sheep on it, and therefore you got your mutton and lamb. You see, and it's one of those things where, oh wait, isn't doing this more efficient use of land than not doing it?
Which is a reverse argument, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. And most people go, I don't like the look of sound of that, but it's one of those things where, with the fact that we've got to feed another 2 billion people, you've got to look at these where we can get these efficiency from. It's like, do you buy free range food, or do you buy battery based farm food? And the obvious answer is, what do you mean? I would, if you're an animal lover, I'll go and buy the free range, or probably not buy it at all. Well, that's great and all, but you actually sacrifice more land, more resources than have them free ranged, as opposed to the factory farming, or where they are so efficient in regards to producing meat, in regards to, it's sort of one of those things where factory farmers use so little space.
But when something goes wrong, it tends to go wrong big time with those, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You get an infection through there, and, chickens are well known for sort of that problem. So, Paul, let's ask you a simple question. People think about, let's have some chicken for dinner, and I talk to a lot of my students, and they don't like this idea of sort of beef and pork and lamb and so on, but they still eat chicken. And, I say to them, well, they sort of battery farmed, and they go, well, probably, rather than sort of think of the fluffy chicken running around the farmyard. So how long does a chicken last from when it hatches to, in theory, when it can actually appear on my plate?
Well, I thought it was something like daft, like 80 days. But we did a little bit of Googling around, and apparently it's 42.
42 days.
42 days to go from hatched egg, because obviously hatching takes a small bit of process, but from hatched egg to effectively slaughtered and into chicken nuggets pre-cooked, as opposed to on your doorstep.
Yeah.
It's 42 days. That's how efficient the animal growth, or more precisely, we have made animal growth, has become. It's scary in that regard.
But let's look at, if you want to do that with a free range, it's actually longer.
Oh, yes.
Now, why is that? Well, these chickens are kept warm, so they don't have to use lots of energy up for keeping warm. Instead, they can use that for growing. They don't run around very much. Well, they don't really run around at all. So they're not wasting energy running around. They're just turning that basic energy of food straight into meat. And 42 days is not much of a life for a chicken to sort of just grow and sort of, suffer for sort of 42 days, really.
No, I know it's a bit sad in regards to that time scale, but it is what it is.
Are you prepared to pay more for your chicken to know that it had a good life before it was killed, rather than not?
Yeah,
because your average chicken can live 3 to 5 years.
It is said that the average is 4, so 3 to 5. Yeah, about right.
And we have to think about sort of what you're prepared to accept and what you're prepared to pay for. So animals are not efficient, really, because they take crops and they then convert that into meat. So, and there's more carbon dioxide produced in that. But it also gives more variety. And a lot of people do like, eating some meat. I think we're getting to a stage where more and more we are going to be eating more sort of vegetables, more vegetable crops, more plants, if you like, and less meat. But I don't think we're going to get rid of meat altogether.
No. It's one of those things where you've got to look at, in regards to diet, how much energy you get out of meat from plants, as in protein, but also meat contains a lot of the minerals we need. It contains a lot of all the
amino acids,
everything we need, as opposed to the plants where they just don't have it. So you got to take the supplements, and then you got to look at, those supplements, how are they made, and all that? It's their worst production emission wise than actually the beef that that had there in it.
It's an awkward argument, this, isn't it? It's sort of my opinion for the way it ought to go, and it's only my opinion, is it's moderation. You eat less meat, you eat more fish, you eat sort of, I know that's still meat, maybe you go to eat more sort of insects or other types of things like that type of food, and we cut down on the beef, the pork, the lamb, perhaps even the chickens. And we cut down on some of that and eat some more of the other one. And we're still omnivores. We're still supposed to, and we're designed to eat a little bit of everything.
Yeah, there has been a radical shift in diets, but it's only radical in the developed world, where this is happening, because of course
It's money.
It's money, really. It's meat is cheap, and meat is cheap for a reason. Until that changes, it won't be. The developed countries, or the developing countries, shall I say, they will focus on meat because it's cheap and easy, as opposed to being the difficult choice of having to eat other things that cost more to grow and to produce.
So how could you actually get more, if you like, plant from the same land? And the answer is we can cheat. And one of the ways we can cheat, and I started to see this more, is vertical growing. You and I went to Twickenham.
We went to Twickenham Stadium, and they've got a wall. Several walls. I looked it up, of just green space. Now, they were doing it to actually do insulation, that's fine in itself. However, it's actually the wall matter is a plant basically wall. And did you know that plants don't actually care whether they're flat or above each other? They really don't care, as long as they get sunlight and they get the water.
Yeah. And of course their carbon dioxide, which is doing a bit of good. Yeah. So, you have things like the strawberry pots that are vertical. And we got quite a lot of vertical containers, and you can start doing more vertical gardening, and that can get more yield from a certain space. Now, I've managed to sort of one year, I decided to plant my runner beans rather than outside. I decided to put them in the greenhouse. I was a bit lazy, actually. And we used to get a fair yield, but this time we got absolutely enormous yield from about 3 plants.
We were eating runner beans. Well, I say we. Most of us were eating runner beans for
Decades, it felt like. Yeah. It was a jungle, though. I will be honest. My greenhouse was a jungle before, its demise.
Well, yes, but it's one of those things where you see these vertical, and it is that space efficiency.
Can you grow underground?
Well, I say it's a simple argument. As long as there's water and there's light, it's no problem.
And so these tunnels under London, which were used in World War II, are starting to be converted to grow all sorts of plants like basil and aubergines and all sorts of sort of plants that sort of don't mind growing in these sort of necessarily these conditions.
And all I say about that is their light has to be generated, and it could be generated by biogas, or at least a bio, has to be sustainable. This is the whole linking up these things. You can't just grow more and just emit it elsewhere. No, you're going to have the whole chain has to be focused on reducing emissions and by growing and producing more.
It is choosing the right sort of crops. It is perhaps changing some people from one type of diet to another type of diet. We don't have to make sweeping changes in our diets to have this positive impact. We've only got to make minor changes and perhaps choose the crops that we're growing rather than for growing it for a traditional reason, but for a more sort of sensible reason that we can sort of grow different things.
Well, I hear that and I go, people like rice, and rice is very good. It's very simple food, but unfortunately it does produce a lot of methane. Now, from outcome, we were from COP, that great grand event. There was this whole splurge about methane, and they said, unfortunately, rice production is increasing, about sort of 10% a year, because of course, more rice, more people to feed, understand the picture. But of course, the methane emissions is actually going up 5% inside that 10, which is bad. So then you're sort of like, how can we increase rice production, but actually emit less methane, or somewhere to change? And this is go back to they're looking at modifying the rice to actually find better rice seeds or better rice species that produce less rice or more rice, but less methane.
Yeah.
Which is a critical thing in this battle against climate change, and yet feeding the 9 billion people yet to come.
So it's a case of trying to increase our biodiversity and the diversity of our diets and what we can do with them. Yeah, so we can grow more crops and basically more food in less space if we do it wisely. And fortunately, most of our farmers are really quite good at doing this. They're leading the charge on this.
They are indeed, because it makes economic sense for them to do so.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for listening to our weekly podcast on Going Green, and we'll be back next week and we'll look at some more issues with Going Green. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And a goodbye from me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.